Jesus never called anyone a Christian, not once. Not in Matthew, not in Mark, not in Luke, not in John. In the entire recorded ministry of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, the parables, the conversations with Pharisees, the private moments with his disciples, the word Christian does not appear a single time from his mouth. And I think most people, when they actually stop and sit with that fact, find it at least a little disorienting, because we've inherited this word. We use it constantly. It's on buildings, on bumper stickers, in census forms. It's the word the entire tradition has organized itself around for 2,000 years, but it wasn't his word. So the question I want to work through today is not just a historical curiosity. It's something I think has real weight. If Jesus didn't use that word, what did he use? What did he call the people who followed him? And does the distance between those words, his and ours, tell us something we've been missing? Let's start with the word itself, because its origin is more interesting than most people realize. Christian appears exactly 3 times in the entire New Testament. 3. Acts 11:26, Acts 26:28, and 1 Peter 4:16. That's it. And in none of those 3 instances is the word used by Jesus. In Acts 11:26, it appears almost as an aside. The text notes that the disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. Called. Passive voice, as in other people started calling them that. The Greek word is Christianos. It's a Latin-style formation. The suffix "ianus" was commonly used in the Roman world to indicate allegiance to a person or a movement. Herodians followed Herod. Caesariani followed Caesar. Christianoi followed Christos. It was, in its original context, almost certainly a label applied from the outside. Possibly as mockery. Possibly just as identification. But not a name the early followers chose for themselves. Now, none of this means the word is wrong or shouldn't be used. That's not the point. The point is that when we go looking for how Jesus himself described the relationship between himself and the people who followed him, we have to look elsewhere. And what we find there is genuinely worth paying attention to. The word Jesus used most consistently, the one that appears over 250 times across the 4 Gospels and into Acts, is the Greek word mathetes, disciple. And I want to slow down here because I think we've heard disciple so many times that the word has gone a little flat. We know it means follower. We know it's the word for the 12. And so it tends to slide past us without landing with the weight it was supposed to carry. In the first century world, a mathetes was not simply someone who agreed with a teacher's ideas. It wasn't passive. The relationship implied proximity. You followed your teacher physically. You watched how he lived. You imitated his habits. You absorbed not just his content, but his way of moving through the world. The Roman-era biographer Plutarch uses the word in this sense. The relationship was formative in a way that went far deeper than intellectual agreement. When Jesus says in Matthew 28:19, the Great Commission, "Go and make disciples of all nations," he isn't saying, "Go and make believers. Go and make people who agree with me." He's describing something much more demanding, a relationship that reshapes the whole person. The gap between Christian as a label and disciple as a relationship is, I think, exactly where a lot of modern faith gets lost. You can identify as a Christian, culturally, nominally, on a form, without that word asking anything of you. Mathetes doesn't work that way. By definition, it requires proximity. It requires that something in you is being formed by something outside you. But there's a moment in John's Gospel where Jesus uses a different word entirely, and it's the one that, personally, I find the hardest to sit with. John 15:15. The night before the crucifixion, Jesus is speaking to his disciples, the ones who have been with him for 3 years, who still don't fully understand what's about to happen. And he says, "I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends." The Greek word is philoi, friends. Now think about what that shift means in context. He's not softening the relationship. He's not making it more casual. He's moving from a hierarchical model, servant and master, student and teacher, to something that, in the ancient world, carried its own very serious weight. Friendship in the Greco-Roman world, as Aristotle laid out in his Nicomachean Ethics, was not a light thing. True friendship, philia, meant shared purpose, mutual knowledge, a willingness to tell each other the truth. It was the deepest form of voluntary human bond, and Jesus applies that word to his disciples on the night before his death. I've been thinking about why that word almost never appears in how Christians describe themselves or their relationship to Jesus. We say believer, we say follower, we say servant, and servant is not wrong. Jesus uses that too. But friend carries something those other words don't. It implies that you are known, that the relationship goes in two directions, that what happens to you matters to the other person. That's a different kind of weight than a label on a census form. There's one more name I want to bring in because I think it's the most underappreciated of all of them. Before the word Christian existed, before it was coined in Antioch sometime in the mid-40s AD, the early followers of Jesus had a name for their movement. They called it the Way, he hodos in Greek. You see this in Acts repeatedly. In Acts 9:2, Saul of Tarsus, before he becomes Paul, is described as going to Damascus to arrest followers of the Way. In Acts 19:9 and 19:23, the same language. In Acts 24:14, Paul himself uses it to describe what he belongs to, the Way. Not a belief system, not a religion in the institutional sense, a path, a direction of travel, something you are on, not something you simply hold. I find something almost quietly devastating about the fact that this name fell away. Because the way implies movement. It implies that wherever you are right now is not the destination. It implies that the point is not arrival, but the ongoing act of walking, and that what matters is whether you're still moving in the right direction. Compare that to Christian as an identity marker. A Christian is something you are. The way is something you are on. That's not a small difference. One is a static category, the other is a description of motion. Now, I'm not arguing we should all start calling ourselves followers of the Way, though the early church apparently thought it was a fine name. I'm pointing at what gets lost when the language shifts, when a movement becomes a membership, when a direction becomes a denomination. So here's where I land after sitting with all of this. Jesus called people disciples, people being formed by proximity to him. He called them friends, people who are known, not just loyal. And the movement he started was called the Way, something you are on, not just something you are. Christian came later. It stuck, and it's carried 2,000 years of meaning, some of it beautiful, some of it complicated. I'm not interested in throwing it out, but I do think there's something worth asking yourself, quietly, without performing the answer for anyone. Which of those words actually describes your relationship to this? Are you a label or a disciple? A category or someone on a road, because the word Jesus chose says something about what he thought he was offering, and it wasn't a title? Tell me in the comments. Of those three, disciple, friend, the Way, which one lands differently for you? Which one feels like it's asking something you hadn't quite heard before?